Hello and welcome to another Open Democracy podcast. This is Tony Curzon-Price and this recording was made on Friday the 15th of June 2012. This is a new experiment in my podcasting. What I'm doing is trying to have a conversation with a generalist, not an expert, someone who can fill in the gaps of my own knowledge. And in this particular case of Greek history, I've had a very strong sense that I don't really know enough about how the Greek nation has come to be, and that I need actually some background historical culture to be filled in. And my thought in doing this was to go to someone with an excellent generalist historical knowledge, and not to the Greek specialist who's going to take for granted much more than, in my case, and possibly in your case, they should. And I therefore turned to Terence Mitchison, who is a generalist historian, has been a lawyer for much of his career in London, and I can think of no one better to try this experiment with. So here goes, and make sure to tell me what you think of it. You can email me at tony@curzon.com, or of course comment at Open Democracy. We're all utterly fascinated and glued, not only by the soap opera aspect, what's going to happen in the elections, but it seems to me, but also genuinely in trying to understand how any country, a country like Greece in this particular case, what it means to be a member of, to be part of Europe, what it means to be Greek. All these are questions which are difficult questions and huge questions, but it seems to me that we should all have we should all try to have a better understanding and sense of. Let me launch into this by. So one of the really good pieces that we published on Open Democracy, it's now some time ago, it was in September 2010, in the early days of the Greek crisis. It's a piece by Aristos Doxiadis, who's based in Athens, who's a professional in Athens, has been an academic in various places, and it was I thought an fascinating piece. I encourage you to go and read it. It's called The Real Greek Economy: Owners, Rentiers and Opportunists. And it was a description of the state of the Greek economy. It was a real eye-opener to me because it had a real understanding of the economic structure of Greek society, and it was very unexpected. And it not only was that, but it also went back and tried to explain the structure of the Greek economy today with reference to various historical roots. So, and in fact, in that one of the observations in that article was an observation about land ownership and land ownership structure, and the fact that there's actually very little medium-sized or large-sized manufacturing industry in Greece, and Aristos brings that back to land ownership structures as they emerged in the 19th century out of the Ottoman Empire. So maybe that's a place that we could start. We can go back and we can go forward from there. But that 19th century history, again, schoolboy history memory of history says 1832, the Greek nation is born. It's never so simple.
I thought,
Terence.
Certainly that particular article was very perceptive and, shall we say, very honest and very candid. I think about Greek history and the effect which both history and geography have had on the current Greek economy. As you say, if we look back to the origins of the modern Greek state, what we have, of course, is the Ottoman Empire and from the 15th century, from the fall of Byzantium in the mid-15th century, right through to the early 19th century when there were first stirrings of Greek independence. Of course, the way British people tend to relate to that is rather to see it through Lord Byron's eyes, the romantic hero of the Philhellene movement, his sort of tragic death during the course of the Greek War of Independence,
and this rather interesting thing, it seems to me, from the British perspective, which it seems to me that is still there in many ways, which is that Philhellene movement is sort of buying into a myth, isn't it? It's not really buying into the reality of Greece in the early 19th century. It's buying into the thought that it's buying into 4th century BC Greece. It's the Greece
yes.
of ruins. It's not the Greece of people are speaking Turkish at the time in the Peloponnese. They're the Greece for that Philhellene movement is entirely a romantic construction, isn't it?
I think very largely it is. It's probably the fact that many of the British aristocrats who would have gone on the grand tour to Italy suddenly find they can't go because of the Napoleonic Wars. They get diverted to Greece, have probably a sort of slightly scary experience, but they trip around on the various temple sites, in the midst of a country that's sort of scarcely ever peaceful, simmering unrest, brigandage, etc. And they're very aware of the past. There's impressive classical monuments, but at the same time, there's a sort of terrible contrast, I suppose, between the remembered school classics, the wonderful reading of
Homer. Yes,
Homer, exactly. And the current pitiful reality, etc., of the sort of very impoverished country being oppressed by the Turks. There's an element of sort of romantic outrage about all this. That Greece might still be free, etc.
And can you speak a little bit to this oppression by the Turks? Because at least one impression we have of the Ottoman Empire is a truly multicultural empire, is one in which the Orthodox Church has independence. It's autocephalous. I think they call it.
Yes, I think there are, shall we say, both the very positive and the very negative views of the Ottoman Empire. I think most people are well aware that it was the most tremendous, as it were, superpower of its day in the 15th and particularly the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent. In a way, one of the most civilized states in Europe. I think the easiest way to characterize the Ottoman Empire is that it works very well and benevolently for the settled areas, the areas that are part of the Ottoman heartland, where taxation is relatively light and people, even the Christians or non-Muslims, are treated with relative leniency. The problem is really that it's essentially a fighting machine. The assumption is that the warriors of the edge are going to behave quite ruthlessly, live off the land, loot and pillage where they are, and indeed they do.
But talk a little bit about the geography here and the geography of the Western Ottoman Empire, because the Balkans are that border. We usually think of Greece as really being in the Eastern Balkans, and therefore not being on that frontier. Is Greece really... and let's say, not only Greece, but actually all those Christian populations in the Black Sea, the Romanians, etc. This forms what one feel. I mean, is it really the front line of battle of Ottoman expansion, or is it actually one step back from that front line?
I think the truth is, most of the time, there's quite a lot of Greece that is, shall we say, a little remote from the front line, but there's an awful lot of Greece that is coastal. And also an awful lot of Greece that is subject to the continued conflicts that go on between essentially the Venetians, the great maritime power that effectively lost out to the Turks with the fall of Constantinople. They were the great trading power that had this grip on the Eastern Mediterranean and indeed previously the Black Sea. Their great commercial trading empire is sort of cut into by the Ottoman Empire and effectively squeezed as hard as possible. So this continuous war goes on really from the 15th century almost up to the beginnings of Greece in the 19th century.
Right, and so piracy is a real problem in this part of the world.
It is indeed. The Venetian Republic gets extinguished by Napoleon in 1797, but up to then, basically, you have the Venetians in what are called the Ionian Islands, familiar to most people as Corfu and Kefalonia, on the western Ionian side of Greece. But probably less well realised is that the Venetians hung on to Cyprus until quite late in the 17th century, and indeed to Crete and various other islands, and quite a lot of the Greek mainland as well. So there were continuous episodes of fighting going on through these centuries. Of course, the thing that most people are well aware of is that the Acropolis, sort of wonderful Greek classical temple standing above Athens, had effectively been treated by the Ottomans simply as a place in which to leave their ammunition. The Venetians turn up in the exchange of fire. A Venetian cannonball lands in the Acropolis, attempting to destroy the Turkish arsenal, and of course the whole thing goes up, and the middle of the Acropolis is blown to pieces, and they're still trying to stick the thing back today.
Right, and
it's memorable casualty.
of course, Athens is only has at that time is a sort of impoverished place that only has its classical monuments to speak for it, isn't it? I mean, it's not even a major trading city at the time.
Hardly anything happens in Athens. It's just literally, as it were, an encampment really around the classical remains. And those who did turn up and, as it were, noticed what was going on tended to record it as being sort of impoverished and pitiful. Of course, later on you have Lord Elgin turning up and seeing the incredibly damaged state of the remaining memorial, the fact that the Turks and local builders were simply sort of stripping bits off the Parthenon. He decides to intervene, gets permission effectively to take the Elgin marbles back to London, partly with a view to saving them for posterity, and partly with a view, slightly more commercially, of selling them to the British Museum, which eventually he persuades Parliament to fork up the money to repay him his costs and makes a little profit out of it.
Good for him. Yes. Well, yes.
Quite possibly the Parthenon would be lost entirely, or a large part of the wonderful marbles could easily have been destroyed. That was at a moment just before the Greek War of Independence, which really starts in 1814 and goes on for another 16 or so years.
Just before we go, I mean, obviously we need to move on, but before we do, one thing that struck me, and which it seems to me is important to note, or at least struck me as being rather interesting in the modern context, is that is Ottoman administration of its Orthodox Christian populations essentially the head of the church was given the patriarch was given a tax collection target, wasn't he? And somehow or other he had to raise it from the Christians. I mean, there are at least echoes of the Troika's demands today, aren't there? Which is, look, we don't really mind how you do this, but you've got to raise this money.
Has very considerable powers in terms of civil and family jurisdiction over the Christian, i.e. the Greek population in Greece, and of course over Orthodox subjects throughout the Balkans. There's also, I think, a sort of group of people who are generally known as the Phanarians from the particular district in Constantinople, who are largely Greek, highly educated, intelligent people who got to work the Ottoman system, and they find themselves posts throughout the Ottoman establishment. The Turks do the fighting, the Phanarians very often are the people at the top of the civil administration, and so the Greeks in positions of control throughout the Ottoman Empire. And many of them think that it's only a matter of time for these sort of rather lazy warrior Turks essentially give way to something that is far more controlled by the Greeks. And of course, the origins of the Greek War of Independence start with a Greek Phanariot called Ypsilantis, who gets what he supposes is some Russian nod or wink to start a rebellion in what is now Romania. That all fizzles out. The Tsar disowns him, but very shortly afterwards there's the main rebellion in Greece itself, centred in Peloponnese. But sorry, that sidesteps your question, which is really about, I suppose, the question of taxation.
Well, taxation and also the foreign power's involvement in that, and the sense that in some ways, in this case, the authority of the church, which was the identity, which carried the identity of not at the time Greeks but Christian Ottomans, the identity of the church, the relationship of the church, that the church was a tax-raising authority but not an autonomous one that where that tax raising was imposed from outside.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And to a large extent, I think the Turks thought that they had co-opted the Orthodox Church and its patriarch and its establishment hierarchy to help them run, as well, the civil affairs of their empire. And to a large extent, they were successful in this. I think the problem, and to a large extent, obviously, with the Phanarians and the other aspects of the civil administration of the Ottoman Empire, a great many Greeks were, if you like, sort of complicit in working with the Ottomans in running a system which was, frankly, fairly arbitrary in many ways. There were quite ruthless exactions of taxes. Basically, if you found villagers who seemed to be reasonably prosperous. It was quite likely that they were going to be squeezed and coerced in a fairly arbitrary way to pay their taxes and whatever the tax collectors could grab.
Can you...
The pot. And of course, the Ottoman Empire is not unique in that, but it probably carries on in a fairly arbitrary way well into the 19th century, when other people perhaps are becoming a little more bureaucratic, civilized, and orderly in their administration.
And can you speak a little bit of, and again, I'm a little bit confused over. I'm having a little bit of difficulty identifying groups here, and I suppose partly it's what language they speak. Is there a Greek language that is generally spoken by Christian Ottomans, by traders in Greek cities? Is it a linguistic identity? Is it a religious identity? What is Greekness in the Ottoman Empire? Does it exist? Is it simply the same as being Christian, being Orthodox Christian? What is it?
You make a very valid point. I think it's not the same as being Christian. I think what we have is a quite well-established identity for the Orthodox believers. Now, the Orthodox believers are people who live in sort of the Balkans, which is modern Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania. Obviously, the sort of boundaries of Orthodox Christendom sort of run up against the Catholic countries,
yes,
which are essentially sort of be bits of Bosnia, Croatia, Hungary, etc. And of course, there are a large number of Orthodox believers. Most, in fact, are going to be outside in Russia, in the domains of the Tsar, what is now Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, all under the Tsarist Empire at that stage. There are also a great many. We look at the sort of, so that's the sort of religious divide.
Yes. And in fact, I mean, just as a note, they actually called themselves Rooms, didn't they? They were Romans. It was the Roman Empire.
Yes,
they didn't call themselves Greeks at all.
Well, I suppose the perception was that Greece and Byzantium was the legitimate heir of Rome. The Roman Empire had, of course, been split by Constantine back in roughly sort of 300, and Constantine built Constantinople, which was the new Rome, and that, as well, was the capital of the Roman Empire. It was the base for future Roman civilization politically and to a considerable extent culturally. The Western Roman Empire, of course, fell to the Goths, disappeared in the 5th century, and the Byzantine Empire lasted for another 1,000 years. So the Greeks had some justice, I suppose, for seeing themselves as the heirs of Rome. But of course, this was quite distinct in a way from the religious issue, where, although Orthodox and Catholic Christianity started out on very much similar theological lines, there had been a whole series of differences, partly to do with the relative importance of the patriarchates, the sort of the main seats of bishops. The Bishop of Rome obviously thought he had, he was the heir of St. Peter and had primacy. This was not accepted by the Eastern Church. There were other slightly more recondite splits due to things about the doctrine of procession, whether you the precise relationship of the father to the son.
Yes, well, it's the filioque
argument. All of those things.
Yes. But I think this is taking us a long way. But I do have this I do have this question of the identity of what is this? Is there a linguistic identity, for example?
There is certainly a Greek language, or perhaps sort of various versions of the Greek language, but there are people who speak Greek throughout a large part of the Ottoman Empire, and they're not merely in what we now call Greece. They're very often scattered through the Balkans. There are these people, Phanariats and other traders, who are certainly present in as a minority, a probably privileged minority, in the northern parts of the Balkans, Bulgaria, Serbia,
and Asia Minor, presumably, or throughout Asia Minor.
To a very large extent. Yes. There are large settlements of Greeks, as it were, in Asia Minor. What is now the city of Izmir was called Smyrna before, and right around the coast of Turkey, and also in what is now Syria, Lebanon,
right,
and Palestine, and a very large Greek community in Alexandria, perhaps a third of the population of Alexandria in Egypt, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire.
And then, of course, the Black Sea as well. The many Black Sea ports.
Black Sea. I mean, effectively, the Greeks spread right around the Ottoman Empire, and they had been there probably before the Ottoman Empire. They continued effectively to flourish as traders under the Ottoman Empire. In many ways, the Ottoman Empire was very good for the development of Greek commerce, seafaring, overseas trade. a very vibrant commercial community, linked by language, linked by religion, linked by a sort of common conception of Hellenism, but probably nobody could quite define exactly what it was.
And that language is a close relative of the modern Greek spoken in the streets today, is it?
Well, yes, I think the Demotic Greek, the Demotiki, as it were, probably evolved. It wasn't very much a written language that later became so in the 19th century. There were attempts during the 19th century, as the modern Greek state evolved, to use what was called the Katharavousa, the purified Greek language, which was thought to be a little closer to classical Greece. And there was some, shall we say, sort of conflict or confusion about the attempt to impose a Katharavousa version on the official administration,
which was became an elite mark of being a past elite.
It became a sort of a slightly elite language. And the moment when I think somebody actually published the New Testament in the Demotic version, I think around 1901, and attempted to use this, there were actually riots in the streets of Athens. It was actually quite a contentious issue. People were using the Demotic Greek, but it somehow didn't quite have respectability until considerably later.
Right, okay, so I think I'm now clearer on what we mean by, as it were, Greeks before the formation of the Greek nation in 1832.
Yes.
At least a little bit clearer. It's a dispersed community, it's trading, it actually lives under several... it's not exclusively Ottoman, presumably. I mean, it goes up the Danube, and there will be in that frontline zone, which is sometimes Ottoman, sometimes not.
Yes, that's right. And there are Greek communities, of course, in many other cities in Italy, France, Western Europe.
Vienna, for example. Yes, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes, and in Venice, for example. For example, the Ionian Islands, which are quite significant for Greek independence. Obviously, they are essentially Greek. Venetian administered, some of the population become Catholic. Some, like a very important figure, the Count of Capodistrias. He is somebody whose family probably originally come from the Istrian Peninsula under Venice, but is a kind of a minor nobleman in Corfu. He has a very illustrious career as kind of senior minister of the Tsar, Tsar Alexander, and performs a kind of important role in linking sort of Russia into the struggle for Greek independence. And he's perhaps a sort of rather interesting figure in showing, I suppose, the cosmopolitan nature, the openness to external influences, the involvement of other powers in what essentially becomes a great.
So let's go back. Let's go back to that independence, that moment of independence, because that war again. This is not 1848. This precedes 1848. It's not the birth. It's not the spring of the nations. It's actually. Would you agree that it's a sort of? It's to an extent a foreign power construction and creation.
To an extent, I think what you have to bear in mind is probably that the impact of the Napoleonic Wars and the Enlightenment comes to Greece, but it comes to Greece a little bit late. And there are a number of intellectuals who are sort of powerfully influenced, some of them living in Austria. And somehow or other there is some cooperation between these people outside, merchants and as well the more influential citizens in the Peloponnese and in central Greece, and also a link up with, shall we say, frankly, more disreputable forces, people like the so-called Kleftes, the brigand chieftains who live in the mountains, rarely submit to Ottoman authority, and to some extent living by brigandage and looting. All these elements gradually coalesce. There are instances of oppression which actually help forge resistance against the Turks. And there's an organisation, I think, the sort of basically sort of founded abroad, but which spreads through Greece, that actually develops a conspiracy to have this sort of coordinated revolution in several Greek towns and cities. So there is a kind of revolutionary master plan.
Right, and that is a sort of you'd characterise that as being a nationalist is it a sort of precursor of 1848? Is it a nationalist movement, a nationalist democratic movement, or would you characterize it as being something else, as being part of this Philo-Hellene movement? I mean, yeah.
I think what you'd have to characterise as something that meant slightly different things to a lot of people. People's motives for joining in, I think, were enormously varied. In the case of people like Capodistrias, who in many ways was one of the leading figures, he's probably an idealist, somebody who would clearly have had a very successful career anywhere else, but feels this attachment to what is not even exactly purely his native country. He doesn't even sort of view it from the point of view of a Porfirt citizen, but he has this idealistic view that Greece could arise, be a civilized power, essentially.
And is this Republican? I mean, because one of the striking things that happens is precisely that the outcome is not a republic, despite it being at the.
Yes, I think the thing is that actually, to begin with, many of the people involved are essentially revolting against local oppression. They don't necessarily see that they're going to create a fully independent and absolutely sovereign Greek state. So I think the idea that there is necessarily a fixed idea of complete Greek independence is it's wrong. There is an attempt to react to a quite oppressive and arbitrary government. Quite often the people who I suppose are oppressive may not necessarily be ethnic Turks. They could be the church authorities or the so-called sort of village headmen, who are often Greeks but acting effectively as tax collectors or administrators for the Turkish emperors. So you have a reaction against misgovernment, an aim to create at least an autonomous state, something where there's perhaps more opportunity to end particular sorts of oppression,
right?
Kind of particular concerns, I suppose, about A, Turkish taxation, B, about the practice of the child tribute. A number of sons from each village were usually taken into the corps of janissaries, the Turkish army, or the civil administration. But at various times this is seen as irksome, and at certain stages I think it sparks rebellion in particular places. But there are a whole series of aspects of arbitrary Turkish government that are highly unpopular. So the Greek rebels essentially are looking to ameliorate that, establish a degree of independence, not necessarily a totally separate country.
So one gets to the point of independence. Of course, there's the where Russia, Britain play substantial roles, don't they? I mean, the Battle of Navarino, the sea battle is very much a battle of great powers against the Ottomans, isn't it? But
yes, I think the way it starts out, though, is essentially a local revolt that actually the great powers view with considerable suspicion, because bear in mind that at this time Napoleon has just been defeated at Waterloo, there's the Congress of Vienna, all the great powers of Europe essentially are trying to put the lid on any kind of radical or liberal or Republican sentiments. On the whole, they don't view with any sympathy the idea of small people revolting against a great power. But what goes wrong in Greece is really that initially the Greeks are a bit successful. Then the Sultan turns around, overreacts. He can't actually do anything terribly effective himself, so he gets his Egyptian vassal Ibrahim to come in with a large army of mercenaries, many of them either Egyptians or Albanians, and basically they behave extremely badly, particularly in the Peloponnese. There are vast massacres. The whole thing becomes an absolutely horrific situation with massacre, counter-massacre, atrocities, and basically the entire commerce of the Eastern Mediterranean is being disrupted. The Russians, who are normally sort of pretty conservative in their attitude, are horrified by what's happening to their co-religionists, the British and the French, who are essentially conservative governments, think the situation can't be tolerated. So the powers attempt to intervene, send their fleets into the Aegean. There is a moment where, in fact, they clash with an Egyptian fleet at Navarino, and almost by accident there's a huge naval battle. The Egyptians are wiped out. in effect by default, the Greeks are able to take control not of all Greece, but of the Peloponnese and the area immediately around them to the north of Athens, but going up perhaps up towards Thessaly, but not including Thessaly. So it's only about perhaps 30 to 40% of the current Greek state, perhaps slightly less.
Yes, and in fact, one of the striking things is in the 100 years after independence, Greece actually increases its territory almost threefold, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Of course,
It's a long, slow process.
It's also the slow process of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, which Greece then is in a position to fill out. But we'll get on to, of course, what happens in 1920, which is the end of that process. But let me get back to the Great Powers, because so there's a local revolt, but nevertheless, what happens after that is the establishment of this completely foreign monarchy, isn't it? I mean, what seems...
Yes, that's absolutely right. You have a brief period during which the powers are scratching their heads as to what to do, and the heroic Kapodistrias tries, in his rather bureaucratic way, to bring order, to impose a sort of rule of law, suppress the brigands, get public works undertaken, repair the roads, collect taxes, and basically all the people who fought in the War of Independence are quite unruly, many of them extremely ungrateful. He quarrels with a man called, I think, Petrobre, Mavro Michaelis, who murders him on his way to church. So basically, this, if you like, is the reasonable bureaucrat trying to persuade his countrymen to behave well, and they won't. And the powers effectively say, well, tut-tut, these unruly people have to have a monarch. It can't be anyone from Britain, France, or Russia or France, and we'll rule ourselves out, but we'll pick somebody reasonably neutral. So they end up with a 17-year-old Bavarian prince, who they call King Otto, who arrives in Athens, gradually learns to speak Greek. He's very charming, and actually plays a bit of a dimwit. He never seems to understand quite what's happening. There are ever increasing sort of faction fights around him, which he tends to ignore. He promises to rule by a liberal constitution, but in fact he never does.
Yeah.
So effectively there's a kind of despotism. He brings his various Bavarian advisors along too, about trying to run the country effectively, and largely do not succeed in doing so.
Maybe worth noting in the current context that I think it must be Otto's father says, yes, well, yes, we're quite happy to take on another throne. We'll do that. But Greece is bankrupt. But Greece is bankrupt, and you better lend us a good pot of money. So actually, the Greek monarchy is born indebted and in hoc. There's a sale of bonds in London to finance the Greek monarchy in 1832.
That's absolutely right, and I think eventually quite a lot is spent on the central infrastructure and essentially on providing as it were things to enhance the court of King Otto and his prestige, but very little spent on the real sort of infrastructure of Greece, and eventually that leads, of course, to a default, I think, in 1843. And the consequence is that Greece is in fact cut out from the international financial markets, I think, until 1878 or thereabouts, when they're able to start borrowing again from overseas sources.
Yes, and this is in a sense already part of Greece being placed within an international system, which in a sense no one has ever asked Greeks to be a part of.
I think the Greeks find themselves, slightly to their surprise, entirely free of the Turks, but essentially having the country run from afar by sort of occasional interventions from the so-called protecting powers, the Russians, the British and the French. These protecting powers intervene from time to time to constrain what Greece can do, notably during the Crimean War, when basically having propped up the Turkish Empire for some time, the Russians are then becoming increasingly sort of irritated with the Turks. They make a series of demands which the Turks resist. War breaks out between Turkey and Russia, Britain and France, or the Turks, against the Russians. The Greeks, of course, sympathise with their co-religionists, the Russians, against the Turks, start raiding across the border. The British and French intervene and send in a small force to occupy Athens to sort of keep the Greeks in order. It's one of those situations where the Greeks, effectively are playing a cat and mouse game and teetering on the brink, not daring to actually come in with the Russians and fight the Turks, because they know perfectly well that they can't afford to break with Britain and France. But that's fairly typical, I suppose, of the state of Greece during the 19th century. It can only go so far. There's a constant attempt to expand their territory to take an anti-Turkish line, but their resources are very limited, and they're not truly independent of the other big powers.
And so let's move on from there to the Balkan Wars of the early 20th century, because that's in a sense the continuation of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, isn't it? And
yes, that's right. I mean, there's shall we say a sort of fairly key period in 1877, 1878, when there's another major break with the Russians, who basically march on Constantinople, persuaded by the British, French, and ultimately the Germans under Bismarck, who act as honest brokers. Basically, the Ottomans lose quite a lot of territory. Serbia and Bulgaria, small Serbian and Bulgarian states are created. The Greeks get a little bit of extra territory in Thessaly and central Greece, but essentially the Ottoman Empire is propped up in the middle of the Balkans, in modern Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, Albania, to struggle on for a bit longer. And it's fairly evident to everybody that the Turkish Empire is crumbling. It's the sick man of Europe. But for various reasons, the powers are quite anxious to keep it in being. They don't like the idea of the Russians seizing Constantinople, anxious about any other power becoming too dominant in that part of the world. So by mutual agreement, it's propped up. The Greeks are quite anxious to complete what they describe as their big idea, the megali idea of ultimately recovering all Greek-speaking territory, perhaps extending as far as Constantinople or taking in the Greeks in Anatolia. But they can only do this very gradually.
Although there are separate Bulgarian nationalist movements at this time who are also taking advantage of the. I mean, there are nationalist movements all over the Balkans, really taking with their own designs, as it were, on the space left by the crumbling Turks.
Absolutely right. So there are a series of sort of conflicts. In fact, the various Christian nationalisms are often in conflict with each other. I mean, the Turks and the Serbs have an observed.
Terence, I think you cut out on this, and I do think it's worth going back. So I think you cut out around the time when we were talking about the various Balkan nationalisms that were looking for a space to occupy in the wake of the Ottoman retreat.
Yes, so after 1878, you have a slightly expanded Greece, you have an independent Romania, you have a smallish Bulgaria and a smallish Serbia, and there's quite a lot of territory in the middle of the Balkans still under Turkish rule. Imminently expected, as it were, that Turkish rule will collapse, and there will be some form of.
And how much? But this becomes a striking feature of the 20th century. How much population movement is there at this point? I mean, when do these nationalisms drive out Muslim population?
No, I don't think they do, because I think the Muslim population largely remains. I mean, in places like Bosnia, which was under Austrian rule from 1878, and in much of the area known as Macedonia or southern Bulgaria, there are still quite substantial Muslim populations.
And in Albania, of course, yes.
Albania, many of the population of the Albanian population, as it were, converted to Islam, as it were, quite considerably further back, and there are Muslim populations in northern Greece. There is some controversy over whether these people are actually ethnic Turks or whether they're Greeks or Macedonians who've embraced Islam. Nobody quite agrees over this.
This notion of, I mean, presumably the ethnicity of the whole region must be an extreme. I mean, what exactly does that mean? It sounds very vexed. I mean, it sounds as if the ethnicity of the region must be really very, very undefinable.
Very indeed, basically. I mean, I think many people will be well aware that Macedonia, as it were, has been a conceptual can of worms and battle among the Balkan people for a long time. There is currently a former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which essentially is a Slav state, and it speaks a language that shall we say, related to Serbian and Bulgarian. Bulgarians often regard the Macedonians as part of Bulgaria. The Serbs have in the past regarded the Macedonians as part of Serbia. The Greeks often take the view that essentially the Macedonians are a kind of a subspecies of Greece, or if they're not, they want to very clearly separate the Macedonians from the Greek population in northern Greece along the current Macedonian border, and try and make sure that various Macedonian symbols are appropriated to Greece rather than being used by what they see as
of course, and recently we've seen the unedifying spectacle of the Greek extreme right party Golden Dawn trying to claim in the midst of this crisis that actually the status of Macedonia and Macedonia's application to EU membership is the most important issue that needs to be faced.
That's right. It may seem quite extraordinary in the current context that people feel, as it were, so violently about a small neighbour, but all of this does go back, as it were, through a very tortured history in the Balkans, where there's been a great deal of bloodshed, a huge amount of competing nationalist claims, and a whole series of wars, obviously, which have cost all these countries very dear, and it's an ingrained part of the national consciousness. People find it very difficult to as it were, forgive and let go of these claims, unfortunately.
So these wars, of course, these Balkan wars, of course, sort of in a sense merge into the First World War, don't they?
Yes. Just looking at very briefly on the Balkan wars, what happens is that the process of Turkish breakdown really starts with an attempt to reform the Turkish Empire by young Turkish officers seizing power in 1908 and trying to reform the collapsing caliphate.
The Young Turks,
yes. Spurs the Young Turks, exactly. That spurs the Italians to have a go at seizing Libya and then the Dodecanese Islands, notably Rhodes, which the Turks had defeated. The Balkan nations then realise that Turkey is really sort of on the point of imploding, and the Greeks get together with the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Montenegrins to launch a coordinated attack on the Turks, which almost drives the Turks entirely out of Europe, but the Bulgarians almost capture Constantinople. And then, of course, having defeated the Turks, they turn on each other. There's a huge fight about the spoils. Basically, the Greeks and the Serbs and the Romanians gang up on the Bulgarians, or vice versa. But anyway, there's a war between those parties. So you have two fairly savage little wars in the Balkans, 1912 to 1913, before you get to the First World War. So the background to the First World War is you have a Serbian state that's done quite well in its recent fights in the Balkans. But one thing it's not very happy about is that the Austrians have intervened to create an independent Albania, blocking Serbia's access to the sea. So very, very strained relations between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, disputes about the, shall we say, the future of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Serbs regard this as their territory. The many Muslim inhabitants of Bosnia are determined not to be incorporated into Serbia,
which is Austro-Hungarian, yes.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Basically, the Russians see the Austrian attempt to crush Serbia as an affront to them and to their ambitions, and things essentially, I think, go out of control. The Germans effectively allow the Austrians to go far further than historically the Germans have normally attempted to preserve peace between Austria and Russia. I think that they thought that they could win a war quickly. I won't go into the history of the First World War, but
no.
By accident you have...
Not this time, anyway.
The First World War suddenly coming out of the blue for most people. Obviously, as far as the Balkans and Greece.
But yes, from Greece's point of view, the First World War. So we have a king who at this point is not a Bavarian king anymore. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because I'm afraid the Bulgarian, he didn't. King Otto, he didn't have a successor, and he wasn't minded to stick to constitutions. He got overthrown in 1862, and then they scratched their heads and thought, well, we need another monarch, and they hunted around. They actually wanted to have one of Queen Victoria's sons, Prince Alfred, but were told that the British should rule themselves out in this particular game. So they ended up with the Danish dynasty and had the second son of the Danish monarch instead. This was King George I, who ruled actually considerably more successfully. He was quite a shrewd individual. He allowed constitutional politics to operate, although extremely unstable. And effectively he was managing to act as the figurehead and behind behind the scenes mastermind of Greek politics very successfully until 1913, when he was murdered by a mad anarchist, and his son, King Constantine I, was rather less adroit. The problem was essentially that as soon as the First World War started, Greece was rather torn in its loyalties. Their natural sympathies were to their co-religionists, the Serbs, who were rapidly defeated by the Austrians. They also sympathised essentially with Orthodox Russia, or minded to support the French and the British, their traditional co-protectors. On the other hand, King Constantine was the brother-in-law of Kaiser William. He and many of I suppose the upper classes in Greece actually believed that German victory was fairly inevitable. So there was both a strong pro-German faction centred around the monarch and a quite strongly pro-Allied faction around a remarkable Cretan politician called Eleftherios Venizelos.
Is he, by the way, so Venizelos is also the name of the current leader of PASOK. Are they by any chance related, as can happen in Greek politics?
It seems that probably they're not. There is some suggestion that Evangelos Venizelos, as it were, simply adopted the name. I don't know how true this is about to say, but it appears that there is no obvious or close relationship.
Okay. It's like having lots of there are lots of Smiths, and
I think there was a Sophocles Venizelos who was quite important.
Okay, so we don't have an example of dynastic politics here yet.
I think it's a slightly we haven't quite got onto that. No. I think the great Venizelos was originally a Cretan who became, shall we say, was invited in effectively to try and deal with the Cretan problem, and was Prime Minister during the First World War. But there was something of a national schism at that point. Basically, Venizelos eventually had to
about who to support. Well, on which side to support in the world in the First World War.
Very strange situation where the British and the French effectively moved against Bulgaria, which was allied to Germany, and they moved against it through Salonika. So effectively, they took over Salonika by force, and Greece was still neutral, and tried to tie down a Bulgarian army and tried to effectively outflank the Turks. But without Greece being actually committed. The Greeks, obviously, under part of the country under Venizelos, actually wanted to fight Bulgaria. There was a horrendous situation when the Bulgarians took a particular Greek fort called Rupel, and some of the officers were ordered, I think, effectively by the royalist officers to surrender this fort.
And is this division the same? Does it overlap a royalist versus republican division? Is Venizelos?
Yes, I mean there has been a royalist republican division perhaps for some time. It becomes vastly more acute at this particular point, where the monarchists see perhaps as being essentially more tied to the urban elite. The Republicans, perhaps more rural, the islands, Crete, etc. There's a distinct suspicion of the monarchy as being essentially, shall I say, sort of corrupt, elitist, indifferent to the ordinary people.
And that cleavage is the same as the German versus German Ottoman.
Yes, I think it eventually gets overlaid. Effectively, the two issues sort of run into each other, and in the heat of the First World War, in the heat of the situation where effectively Venizelos is proclaiming one government in favour of the Allies in Salonika, while the king and his military and civil officials are still running Athens and the area around it. There is effectively almost a kind of civil war. There's no very serious fighting, but there's
a schism
authority, and eventually the British and French effectively intervene, force the king to leave Greece, and Venizelos effectively takes control. This is something that all Greeks agree with. There are many people who are anti-Venizelist in Athens, but effectively the pro-Allied party wins.
And what is there a new constitution, or is there just a constitutional monarchy without a monarch?
We have a very tangled situation for a while the monarchy continues in exile and the Venizelists effectively control Greece. So there's a kind of breakdown of clear authority. I think Greece remains a monarchy until 1924. What actually happens is that Venizelos effectively takes Greece into the Allied side in World War One
and this crucial thing gets an extremely good settlement at Versailles.
Yes, he gets a very good settlement. He gets as well all the territory that Greece had after the Second Balkan War. So he gets the territory that was taken from Bulgaria. He actually gets slightly more. He gets the whole Aegean coastline, and he's also promised effectively by the Treaty of Sèvres territory in what had been Ottoman Turkey. So there's effectively a promise of territory around Smyrna and in European Turkey. The trouble is that this effectively has to be enforced by the Greeks themselves. The Western Allies aren't prepared effectively to send forces into Anatolia.
Well, and Sèvres is the same. I mean, Sèvres is a treaty which Sèvres treaty which didn't work, isn't it? It's the one that gave Kurds also a promise of homeland, wasn't it, as part of the carve-up of the Ottoman Empire?
That's right. The Italians have been promised some territory which conflicts with what Greece has been promised. Effectively, Venizelos is left to make good Greece's own territorial demands, but without the backing of the Western powers.
Right.
And
but the Sultan signs it. The Sultan agrees.
The Sultan is sort of at this stage, more or less powerless and forced to accept the situation. So the Turks are kind of on their knees at the end of the First World War, their entire empire disintegrating, and there's a slightly complicated situation where eventually power passes to a group of nationalist officers with a rather secular nationalistic agenda under Kemal Ataturk.
And indeed, Ataturk's the takeover by Ataturk is, in fact, to some extent precipitated, isn't it, by these concessions that Venizelos has extracted? I mean, it's such an affront.
It's a fairly devastating prospect, I think, for the Turks, that a substantial part of the most prosperous part of their country is going to be taken by the Greeks, a foreign and non-Islamic.
And so that nationalist fire is lit, in a sense, by
exactly. Yes, the Ottoman Empire, having essentially been a fairly cosmopolitan and transnational organisation, although effectively dominated by the Turks, becomes far more explicitly a Turkish national state. There's a clear conflict that erupts about where exactly is the national boundary between the Greeks and the Turks. Kemal Ataturk is determined effectively that the whole of Anatolia, or at least the mainland, is going to be Turkish, resists the Greek incursion inland.
Which has been promised to the Greeks by the Treaty of Sèvres, and so we get this appalling war and this terrible...
So there's a fairly bloody war. I think basically Venizelos is not effectively able to organise. I think at this particular point there is some disruption in the Greek political process where Venizelos is sort of out of power, not able to coordinate matters. There is some degree, shall we say, of sort of failure of organisation on the Greek part. Anyway, their military expedition is defeated very badly by Kemal Ataturk. The Greeks are completely defeated, and the Turks take back all of mainland Anatolia, drive the Greek population from what is now Izmir. And ultimately, there's an agreement between the two governments that there will be an exchange of populations.
And this is what we would today call an agreement to ethnically cleanse.
Yes, in effect, it's an agreement to ethnically cleanse. It's probably somewhat more thorough on the Turkish side, but I think, given that the war had been fairly bloody, obviously those Greeks remaining behind are very frightened of what the Turks.
And the numbers are staggering, aren't they? 1.4 million Greeks leave.
Yes, something like that.
And 400,000 Turks leave Greece.
That's right. And a very large number of Turks leave Greece. There are substantial numbers of Muslims in Crete, in some of the Aegean islands, and also in the north in Macedonia, and old communities scattered around. So there's a substantial departure of either ethnically Turkish or, shall we say, non-Christian population from Greece heading in the direction of Turkey.
And that again, that 1.4 million, that's about a third. What is it? A quarter of the population? Fifth of the population?
A quarter of the population. So that's a huge transfer of population, people who come not entirely, many of them bring quite substantial assets and skills, obviously. They can't necessarily bring everything with them, but there's probably quite an influx of money,
artisans, traders, etc.
property.
But presumably also some sort of deeply rural populations as well in that number, or was it mainly
Yes,
urban?
certainly, that's right. I think it was quite a mix,
Yes.
and I think there were some quite valuable things that came. I mean, particularly the modern tobacco industry that had largely been around Smyrna. So quite a lot of expertise in tobacco cultivation that arrives in Greece, and you have tobacco for the first time becoming a quite substantial Greek export. And in the 1920s and 30s, there's a developing barter trade, particularly with Germany, which then starts to take a substantial chunk of the Greek tobacco exports. That's a useful earner. So there are certainly sort of positive aspects, but it must have been extremely disruptive at the time to have this huge exchange of populations. Of villages.
And also presumably culturally creating a sense, exiled populations have a sense of returning home and of not being, of wanting to return home. I mean, I was very struck visiting the Prince's Islands off Istanbul, which had been islands that had been apparently largely used by Greek traders as summer homes, and there's a strong sense there that there's obviously recently been money put into memory, into remembering this, and there's a strong sense of the longing of the Greeks who'd been moved in the 1920s to return to their homes. So it must. It's quite something to have a quarter of your population having at least some of that sense of longing to return.
I think this undoubtedly must be the case. What one suspects is that with the passage of 90 years, obviously the memory is now fading. I think the residual bitterness about what happened probably is rather ingrained. Whether anybody actually practically thinks that the likelihood of Greek population return is unlikely. The trouble is that there are a whole series of issues that have continued to embitter relations.
But what we then get is an extremely, and we'll get onto this, but this very, very unstable 20s, 30s, 40s in Greece, when that must have been much, much more present as a reality.
That's absolutely right. And what you have, undoubtedly, is for the first time probably a rather large, impoverished and dissatisfied urban population, and you certainly get the beginnings of both a sort of socialist and ultimately of a sort of a strong communist movement, the KKE, the Greek Communist Party, which for the first time begins to make electoral advances in the 1920s, and it becomes a significant force in the 30s and even more in the 40s.
Yes, and again today, as we see.
Yes.
Now, Terence, this has been fantastic. We've gone on an hour. I need to leave, which is great pity. But it seems to me we've got to a very good point, because that the end of the war and that great movement of populations of the 1920s, it seems to me, sets us up for the next piece, and I think we need another hour, which I can't give you now.
Tony, it would be a pleasure to do it to some other more convenient moment, but this has been very enjoyable and interesting for me, and I hope other people have at least thought about some of the issues or been a little entertained by what we've been saying, but it would be very good to resume this at a more convenient moment, Tony.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, and we will definitely do the next chapter, because it seems to me that there's we need to get to the elections, which are happening at the end of this week, is it?
Yes.
Yes.
A fascinating story.
Very good. Terence, thank you very much.
I'll speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Goodbye.